Hi, Scott. Hi, Scott.
Hi, Robert. Or Bob. Which one should I call you?
It's up to you. If you want to remind me of one of my siblings, you can call me Robert. And if you want to remind me of any other living person, you can call me Bob.
Okay, I'll call you Bob today. Did you see my tweet this morning about how excited I was to chat with you today?
How excited you are. Yeah.
Yes.
You must have a big Twitter following because that had a number of likes. If I tweeted something random like that, I would get like 0 likes.
I love my followers. They're awesome. Yeah. I've been slowly building up a good group.
We should talk about your Twitter feed because it's very distinctive. But we should first tell people who you are and who I am. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show. Available on both streaming video and via audio podcast. It's also on the Meaning of Life TV website and YouTube channel. And you are Scott Barry Kaufman, psychologist, proprietor of The Psychology Podcast. And there's only one psychology podcast. And that would be this one. Congratulations on getting to that name first, by the way.
Thank you. I feel like I was like an early adopter with the whole podcast thing. I mean,
how long have you been doing it?
6 years. And in dog life, that's a lifetime.
That's almost Yeah, that's almost a whole dog. Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you.
And you're as people, I guess I already said you're a psychologist. They might infer that from the title of the podcast. Anyway, you've taught a number of places, most recently Columbia, and you've written some books. One is called Ungifted, which is about intelligence, an area that you've studied extensively, and you co-authored a book called Wired to Create, which people who want to create should read. But you've got a brand new book, and that's what we're going to talk about. And so will I. We'll make it. We will make it inescapable. Let's both hold it up at the same.
Oh! You don't have the final version. You have the proofs. Those are the page proofs? Those are the galley.
The galley. But the jacket looks remarkably like the one that you're holding up.
The texture's different though. This is the final version.
Oh, I see. You've got some kind of 3D thing going at your end?
Yeah. It's actually 4D.
4D.
Yeah.
Well, there you go.
Yeah, you can smell the book.
They added the dimension of time to the jacket. That's amazing.
Oh.
So it's called Transcend, the new science of self-actualization.
Yes, I've been looking forward to this conversation ever since our last one where we did a lot of teasers, and things.
That was I just listened to that, and it was good.
It was
shouldn't
legendary.
surprise me because you were involved in it.
Yeah, no, talking to you and that, for me was like a highlight of my life.
I'll bet you say that to all the podcasters.
I don't actually. If you listen, I don't say that often.
Okay.
That was a great chat. That was a really good chat. Yeah. I liked your questions.
That was fun. Of course, for me, it was it was self-indulgent because we talked about me. I took your self-actualization test, and so we talked about my score and my so on. We'll try to avoid that many Bob references this time and focus on the book. Congratulations. Now we're actually taping this a few weeks before it comes out.
Yeah.
And we will not run it until it comes out. We want people to be able to buy it. And, the world may have changed by then. It's strange living in the time of the coronavirus because you really don't know. I mean, like right now, it's something people are taking very seriously, but it's not yet like an American tragedy or anything, It's more like fear of what might come. And I don't know, in 3 weeks, maybe we'll realize the worst is over and maybe we'll realize that things have gotten much worse. I don't know.
I saw a YouTube video, just I think yesterday, of Italians who are quarantined sending messages to themselves from just 10 days ago. Their former selves. I saw a little of that.
So they were saying, so somebody said, what would you say to the you of 10 days ago, right?
Correct. Yeah, you're right. They didn't literally send the message back to the former selves, but yeah, but it is interesting. It was very interesting and elucidating for me to watch that, and I almost wondered if we should do that exercise of what would we tell ourselves 10 days from now, the inverse of that, although I don't know what that would really mean. Yeah.
That's tough. What would you say?
Well, if it does turn out that we're really in bad shape 10 days from now, or even by the time this podcast comes out, all joking aside, like I just want to say to that version of myself and the world that, that we care. Like I care about that person 10 days from now, very, very much. And I'm going to try to do as much as I can do right now, to help the people around me and to take care of myself so that damage is minimized. But, there is this feeling of doom going around, and, you turn on the news and you'll be depressed within 5 minutes because every breaking news is like, you can't get any worse, You think it's worse, and then they're like, we have new breaking news. You thought the other breaking news was bad,
Oh, it could get a lot worse. And then there's the financial news. I mean, and that's a completely unpredictable thing. Where we'll be economically 3 weeks from now.
But what I want to... Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go on.
But that's just kind of compounding the sense of apocalypse.
There's this great Viktor Frankl quote, which I don't want to say the precise words, but like you can take any of our freedoms away, but our ability to kind of choose in the moment and find and choose our own way. And I think that I just am living by those principles at this moment, because it is true, no matter what it says in that news, it can't change. Like they can't force how I react to it, and they can't prevent me from continuing to spread positivity and transcendence. Like I can continue spreading that up until the day I die, right? Like there's nothing telling me that I can't do that, no matter how dire the circumstances. So I just keep trying to think about that fact.
Okay. Well, maybe we should start that process now by talking about your book, Transcend.
Great, let's do it.
So I guess we should assume that most people either didn't listen to our previous podcast or don't clearly recall it. So we should do a certain amount of kind of Abraham Maslow 101 here. I mean, the subtitle of the book is The New Science of Self-Actualization. Self-actualization is a term famously associated with this famous psychologist, Maslow. And let me just say the book has some interesting dimensions. It is, on the one hand, very, very well-told story of Abraham Maslow, along with some kind of debunking of misconceptions about Maslow, including some that have been perpetuated by our Psychology 101 textbooks. I actually went and found the one I used freshman year. The cover's been torn off of it. It was called Psychology, the Science of Mind, and sure enough, here's the diagram of in pyramid form. This is from the book. I think you mentioned the phrase in your book, The Third Force, right? And this is a book that was called The Third Force.
Yes. So I have that book, and I did research on that. Turns out Maslow never drew the pyramid.
Right.
That was the author of that book who drew that. And I think that's really important to recognize. That was sort of their depiction of it. But was that a book that you read for your freshman year?
Well, the book, no, not The Third Force. Oh. This diagram was taken from the book The Third Force. That's what the credit says. This is an introductory textbook that, if the jacket were still with us, would say Psychology, the Science of Mind by George Miller, well-known psychologist, and a co-author named Buchholz.
What year was that?
Well, this would have been like fall of 1975 or spring of 76 that I was taking the course. This second edition of the textbook.
It's very interesting that Miller decided to use that depiction there. That's not even the iconic pyramid. He flattened that at the top, right? He used the one that's flattened at the top.
There, it is flat at the top. I mean, if
that's
you mean
very
visually.
interesting.
So, but this is a good chance to tell people what the pre-debunked conception of Maslow is. I mean, this is the way it appeared in textbooks is, first of all, it's typically called like the hierarchy of needs or something. And at the bottom, it says basic needs, safety and security. And underneath those are like, air, water, food, shelter, sleep, sex, basic needs. And then you get higher on the thing and you get things that aren't strictly required for survival, but many of them are nice to have: love and belongingness, self-esteem, and those are distinct levels, and you go up, and then and then you get up to what are called Well, I guess those are called growth needs too. We'll get into that because you make a comparable distinction. But, and there's a whole list of things, meaningfulness, self-sufficiency, beauty, goodness, truth at the top. Anyway, the idea is that you start with the things you have to have. You got to have those. You build up, and amass, if that's the word, these things that are, strictly speaking, optional, but nice to have. And you're moving towards self-actualization, this thing that's a really great thing to have. And then that's the end of the story, according to this pyramid. There's nothing above self-actualization. And again, there's this idea that it's almost a series of steps you're going through. That's before you correct that, do you want to say anything else about what the received view in the Psych 101 textbooks said, and then you can proceed to revise it as you see fit? Or wait, let me finish what I was going to say. So your book, interesting story of Maslow, and by way of correcting misconceptions about him, you bring, you tell us interesting stories about his actual life, underappreciated things he wrote that nobody pays attention to that are important to you. And then on top of that, you do your whole analysis, and you build a kind of edifice that is, roughly consistent with his, but has your distinctive signature, as well as a lot of, data that you're adding to the picture to get us to transcendence. So, with that as preamble.
That's fair. Most people who take introductory psychology courses or introductory management courses will come across a textbook that will include this iconic pyramid, and the way it's depicted is that, and this is the way the story goes because it's not actually what Maslow actually said, but the way the story goes is that Maslow argued that we have an increasing set of needs. We have a hierarchy of needs, I should say, where we need to fulfill one level before we can get to the next level, as though life were some sort of video game. And once you attain one of the levels, like connection, then some voice from above is like, "Congrats, you've unlocked Steam," and then you and then you hear Mario Brothers music in the background or something. Well, that's not actually how Maslow thought of it. And like I said, he never even drew a triangle or a pyramid. He did have a hierarchy of needs, which was a hierarchy of prepotency, arguing that some needs are more important for us in terms of fulfillment. So there's deprivation needs, and he did make the distinction between deprivation needs and growth needs. And when the deprivation needs are severely deprived, then it really can take over the whole person. We're hungry. We all know what that feeling is like, to go in that state of pure deprivation where, as Maslow said, everything looks like food to you. When the hungry person, it alters your whole way of looking at the world. Actually, I quote you, and did you notice that? I quoted you in my book in that section because you made a great point about that, about how evolution enslaves us, and I thought that was a great point in your own book. Thank you
for that.
Yeah. Plug. And it does. I mean, I'm on the same page with you about that. And really, evolution has we can build. I agree with people like Douglas Kenrick and other evolutionary psychologists who argue that we can build Maslow's hierarchy on an evolutionary foundation. I think that is fair, but my pyramid is not based on a purely evolutionary perspective. It's on a human perspective. It's on from the perspective of the whole organism that is actually living their lives day to day, not the genes that are trying to replicate themselves. And I think they're different perspectives.
Right. I mean, I wouldn't say they're necessarily incompatible. I mean, genes, quote, trying to replicate themselves, even though they probably don't do it consciously, gives rise to a very complex organism with all these needs and things and potentials. Let me ask you a question. The chapter of that textbook that pyramid was in was about humanistic psychology. And I still remember reading about Carl Rogers as one of the humanistic psychologists in this textbook. Maslow was another one. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about what that signified at the time. And a question well, go ahead and just tell us, what is humanistic psychology?
When I discovered this field, I was preparing a lecture at University of Pennsylvania for my Introduction to Positive Psychology class.
My next question was going to be, by the way, was humanistic psychology a forerunner of positive psychology?
Oh, for sure. Okay. For sure. In fact, Abraham Maslow called it positive psychology.
Did he?
Oh, absolutely. He had a whole appendix in the first edition of his book, Toward a Psychology of Being, which was called Toward a Positive Psychology. So he definitely tried to outline that field. And he alternatively called it being psychology. I think he actually preferred the term being psychology to positive psychology. He also sometimes referred to it as ortho-psychology, but that's not as sexy as any of the other alternatives.
No, I'm glad that one didn't catch on.
Yeah, me too. But when I was doing research for my lecture on the history of positive psychology, and I discovered some of the writings, one led to another, I unearthed all these people. It wasn't just Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow. It was Erich Fromm, Karen Horney, who I consider a humanistic psychoanalyst. We had Charlotte Buehler. We have I would put Alfred Adler in there as part of, although he was one of the earlier ones. Him and Horney in the 30s. But all of them, there's a common theme that ran through what they talked about, the kind of themes that they focused on. And there were very different themes than what we focus on today in psychology. So there are a lot of buzzwords in psychology, a lot of things that people really get excited by. And, happiness is one. People love the psychology of happiness. They get very excited over that. Achievement. People love the psychology of achievement. The word greatness. People love the word greatness. Peak performance. People love peak performance. Now, these words were not words that existed in the humanistic psychology literature. Their lexicon I resonated with much more than the lexicon of modern-day psychology. They were talking about things such as responsibility, freedom, creativity,
love,
spirituality, love, humanitarianism, growth. I should say growth. Yeah. And health. Now, these words that were part of their lexicon, for some reason, I don't know what it is about my own being, but it really resonated with the core of my being in a way that modern psychology hadn't, including positive psychology. Now, I say that with all due respect for the field of positive psychology, and as you know, I worked with the founder of the field, Martin Seligman, for quite some years. So this is not, I think we can still have healthy criticism of fields and still have great appreciation and respect for the fields, but still, modern day positive psychologists were still not quite using the same language as the humanistic psychologists. So the humanistic psychologist, if we really did sum it up, as Charlotte Buehler did in her big address I think in the 50s on humanistic psychology, she said, we're interested in understanding the whole person. Mm-hmm. And what they meant by that is they're interested in the integrated human being, the human being that is fully human in the sense that all parts themselves are working as a whole unit, not as a fragmented self. And I think it really did resonate with me because I was interested in evolutionary psychology for many years and still am quite interested in that field and do have respect for evolutionary psychologists, but they focus so much on the modularity of mind. They focus so much on, we have this module and this module. And some evolutionary psychologists have attempted to try to figure out, how do we make a choice or a decision? And you do a wonderful job going through that in your book on why Buddhism is true in terms of what some of the evolutionary psychologists have attempted to do. But I think the way a humanistic psychologist have tackled the issue is ultimately more satisfying for me in trying to understand that.
And how do they try to tackle it?
Well, they do it in a way where they emphasize things like, again, responsibility and free and the connection between freedom and responsibility. These are themes of existential philosophers. I
was going to say it sounds more like philosophy than psychology.
Well, the humanistic psychologists owed a huge debt to the existential philosophers. There's no doubt about that, and they were very open about that. Carl Rogers often he would quote Kierkegaard. I think that's how you pronounce his last name, Soren. roughly that's how you pronounce his name. But and Kierkegaard wrote quite a bit about possibility. Sometimes he said we can drown in possibility. So they really drew a lot on those writings, but they wanted to understand the psychology behind it. They wanted to understand how do humans, how can we as humans live a life where we take full responsibility for our existence? As we're here on this planet in this short amount of time, and we're occupying this space as we go around, and we make consequences on the world. How can we really plumb the depth of our being and our whole self, and accept and take responsibility for not just the good bits of ourselves, but the naughty bits of ourselves, not disavowing the naughtiness or sweeping it under the rug. I mean, I think Maslow called himself a realistic optimist, and that's what I would call myself, if I may. That's how I would describe myself as well. I don't like cynics. I don't like pessimists. I like realistic optimists. That resonates more with me. And we don't have to ignore the worst of humanity, but I think it's also important to acknowledge there is also great potentialities within us as well that can be actualized. Right.
And that kind of relates to one of the not precise parallels I see between humanistic psychology and positive psychology, but a rough kind of parallel, which is that, Marty Seligman, whom we both know, and as you said, you worked with for a long time, and if there's a single founder of modern positive psychology, it would be him. The way he's often put it is that he just felt psychology was so focused on just fixing problems, curing pathologies, making people less bad, and didn't set its sights any higher than that in terms of bringing out, getting them beyond merely functional and merely healthy. And similarly, with self-actualization, there is kind of the idea that, okay, you have these basic needs, these things that if you don't have them, you are deficient. And it's one thing to cure your deficiencies and get you the fundamental things you need. And then you'll be a functioning organism if you have enough food to eat and so on. And if you have, but we can do better. There is love, right. And there is, and so on. So there is that kind of, it's not a precise parallel, but it's there's a relationship, right?
Well, here's what some modern day humanistic psychologists, and there's not that many of them. So, in a lot of ways, I'm trying to kind of bring back I consider myself a humanistic psychologist. I don't call myself a positive psychologist, even though I draw a lot on their work. But I think some criticism from modern day humanistic psychologists of the field of positive psychology is rightly so. I think they argue that positive psychologists don't really take up the task of the fundamental paradoxes of human existence. It's possible to actually do too much of a pendulum swing, right? So the field has focused too much on what's wrong with humans, but you can go too much in the other direction and just say, well, I don't actually care about human suffering. I just care about what brings us happiness. And sort of not integrate that into the whole human. The humanistic psychologists were so interested in those fundamental paradoxes of human existence, which Irvin Yalom calls the givens of existence, and he lists a number of them. And those are the things that I think are fascinating to see how humans reconcile those paradoxes.
So what's an example of a specific example of a given of existence?
Well, I could read all four.
Well, you don't have to. We can, but I guess, Well,
I have the page up. I have the page up now. I'll give you one. So here we have freedom. Freedom often brings us, just the inherent fact that we have freedom in life sets up a human paradox, which is the inherent conflict between the seeming randomness of the universe and the heavy burden of responsibility that comes with the freedom to choose one's own destiny. That is a heavy, heavy burden. Now, the humanist psychologists weren't the first to say that, but and Irving Yalom wasn't the first to say that, but understanding and the psychology of that, I think, is an important task of psychologists, not just understanding, like giving people a life satisfaction questionnaire and say, how happy are you,
Okay. So when you, I know, one thing you want to do, I promise, eventually get to transcendence. The phenomenon, but you, there's a sense in which a pyramid image seems appropriate for what you're doing, just in the loose sense that, as I take it, you're saying transcendence needs a solid foundation, right?
Yes, that's right.
Transcendence, to an extent, it surprised me. The transcendence, as you see it, and as Maslow, I guess, conceived of it, involves peak experiences, right? And of course, anybody could take a drug and get a kind of peak experience, but what you're saying is that there needs to be, to get what you might call authentic transcendence or something, or valid transcendence, there needs to be an integration of your being first, and I take it that includes the not so great things. That includes
yes. Maslow said it. I'll just summarize it in one sentence, one question. Maslow said, "Would you take an elevator to the top of Mount Everest if there was one available?"
Right. Okay. Exactly. So you are building a kind of edifice, even if it's not. Yes. The floors aren't really sequential in a certain sense. You don't have to go through floor 6 to get to floor 7, and there are all these curious aspects of this edifice. But there is a foundation and an edifice that needs to be built before you can get to the transcendence.
It's like a sailboat.
Right. Now that's another thing you have is this sailboat image. You've got the boat. And then you've got the sail, and that corresponds loosely to what in Maslow's scheme was like. The boat is the meeting. Well, maybe not exactly, but anyway, I think it corresponds, doesn't it, to this idea that, you're labeling the hull of the boat security, right? And then the sail is growth. And Maslow might have, he had roughly the same dichotomy in mind, but the boat image is very intuitively appealing. To avoid sinking, you need the things that bring you security. You need to take care of what he called the deficiencies. But to go anywhere, you need the growth.
Exactly. The metaphor seemed to work in a lot of different levels. Also, we're constantly swimming in this sea of unknown, and I think right now that maybe the sailboat metaphor works more than I ever would have thought. I never really imagined that when this book would come out, I would actually be focusing much, much more in my publicity materials and things on helping us secure that boat than I could be talking about the transcendence part. And I've sort of shifted my way of what I focused on in this book now in light of the times. You have to adapt.
Now that's funny. I hadn't thought of that. But yeah, no, this is a time, that when suddenly things people just took for granted.
Exactly.
Like their parents aren't going to die tomorrow, and stuff like that. And just it's easy to go out and buy food at a restaurant. That's no longer possible in New York. I live in the New York area. My town hasn't shut its restaurants, but we're getting there.
This is exactly Maslow's point. Exactly. Each one of these needs is associated with a worldview. And when we have a severe deprivation of a particular need, it locks us into that worldview. So let's talk about connection. If we're profoundly lonely, everyone looks to us as a potential friend, that we want to, we sort of making a demand on the world. We're saying, please love me, please respect me, please feed me. Each of these deprivation needs, when we're in that state of what he called the deficiency realm of human existence, is us trying to control the world. When you're in the growth realm of human existence, or the being realm of human existence, you're not so worried about making demands on the world. You're interested in admiring people for who they are, not the purpose they serve for you, and that's what Maslow called be love or being love. But we all are kind of forced into this deficiency realm of human existence. And to the best of my capacity, at least on Twitter, and I know you said you wanted to talk about that, I just feel like it's part of my mission to just show people that the B realm still exists. It's still there, even though we're kind of locked into this D realm.
Yeah, what I was going to say about your Twitter feed is it's just very upbeat and affirmative. You know, it's not
but
like
I hope not annoyingly so.
No, it's strikingly so because it seems so rare on Twitter. Of course, you know, people talk about Twitter as if it's like this place, but in truth, it's just this specific place you've constructed by choosing the people you follow. I'm sure there are other upbeat, affirmative people out there. You're the one I follow, maybe. But anyway, you stand out from the other people I follow.
Well, thank you. I want to be like the thinking person's optimism, if that makes any sense. Like, I will be one of the first ones to cringe if I read like a lot of unthinking optimism, you know, or just platitudes.
Right.
I'm right there with people who kind of make fun of some of that stuff, and I, you know, and I could still make fun of myself too at the end of the day. Like if I have something maybe I'll read something I wrote 2 days later after I wrote it and I cringe at even what I wrote. But you know, so you know, I get it sometimes, but it's you know, at least I think people get it's the intention, it's what I'm feeling in the moment, and I really want to show people that the B realm is still there, and even when you just tweet something, you're bringing it into existence. I mean, this is what Rollo May talked about in The Courage to Create. He defined creativity as simply bringing into existence something that didn't exist before, and that takes courage, you know, in a lot of ways. And I think more people should be empowered to have that courage to do that in a positive direction, even if everyone else around them is telling them.
No, it does take courage.
Yeah.
It takes courage to be affirmative and positive, you know, because I think, although it's true that, you know, Twitter is no single place, I do think that, broadly speaking, on Twitter these days, just given its demographic, the kinds of vocations that are represented on it, the age groups that are represented on it, it is by and large a pretty edgy, somewhat cynical place. And that's okay with me. It's not, you know, hugely at odds with my own nature, but it is. I think it takes. It probably takes some courage to be you, to be Scott Barry Kaufman on Twitter.
Well, thanks. I wasn't necessarily saying like, you know, look how courageous I am, you know, for I'm doing it.
No, that's my job.
Yeah. I want to make sure that wasn't my point, but. You know, look, there's a difference, though. Wouldn't you agree there's a difference between critical and cynical?
Yes, there certainly is. There's even a difference between, well, maybe having a cynical view of human nature, but viewing people with bemused detachment. In other words, I mean, I think of Michael Lewis, who's somebody I've had on the podcast. I've known him. I knew him. We worked together years ago, and he has a cynical view, but he always makes it seem just kind of amusing, and he makes the human spectacle seem amusing and really not that horrible, even though we are all self-centered scum, kind of.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if I would necessarily describe humans that way, but I think, you know, I do also have a sort of absurdist sense of humor. So I try not to take myself that seriously. I try not to take humans that seriously. But even within that framework, we still don't have to be cynical. I think cynical is something that is a real problem with the world today. Like if I had to put my finger on some of the biggest psychological problems going on there, because there's obviously more economical and other kinds of things, but psychological cynicism is really something that brings us away from being connected with each other and brings us away from a lot of the things that would give us a sense of well-being in our lives. Now,
speaking of connection, if we get back to this security and growth thing, with the security being the hull of the sailboat and the sail being the growth, I don't want to give the impression that the security part is just like, you know, finding enough food and stuff, because the three dimensions you get into under security, there is safety, right? But there's also connection and self-esteem. So you are recognizing that fundamental human needs and go beyond the material, nutritional, and include the social and so on, right? You want to talk a little about that before we
Absolutely.
move on to the growth, the sale part?
Yeah, we are a social species. I mean, one of my idols who I just talked to yesterday for my podcast, Roy Baumeister, has spent a whole career showing just how much of a social species we are. You know, we're the social animal, and other social psychologists like Elliot Aronson have described it as such as well.
Who has a great textbook called The Social Animal, yeah.
That's exactly correct. So that does have to be part of our understanding of human nature and trying to understand when we get in panic mode. It's usually because of something of a social disconnection nature or physical survival nature. It's one of those two is what you tend to see. Now, when I talk about self-esteem, I still, if you noticed in that chapter, I still link it very much to the social drive. And I think that modern psychological science in unearthing this self-esteem motive, for instance, like Leary's model of self-esteem showing that it's so strongly tied to our need for belonging, that it's almost like a sociometer. Mm-hmm. That it's like a meter that wherever our self-esteem is based on how we perceive we are in relationship to how others are perceiving us, you know. And you know, if we feel a sense of shame, we feel like people all of a sudden don't like us, our self-esteem takes a hit. If we feel like people really like us, our self-esteem tends to rise. What I argue is that for each of these forms of each of these needs in the book, there's a deprivation flavor to it and there's a growth flavor to it. So deprivation form of self-esteem is not healthy, you know, the kind where you are constantly dependent on the validation of others. But there's a growth form of self-esteem where you just feel like you're worthy, that you feel a sense of pride. I talk about healthy pride in that book and the difference between unhealthy pride and healthy pride. And I think we can start to see the different flavors of these things. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Now, on the connection front, we already talked a little about Twitter, but you do talk about social media a little in the book. I mean, the landscape of connectivity is very much changed in ways that in some ways it becomes more challenging, right? I mean, technically it's easier. It's easier. I can connect to 1 billion people without leaving my room, but it's a complicated landscape out there, right?
Well, it sure is. In what way are you thinking? It's complicated in many ways.
I mean, I know you. I think you said something in the book that made me think of the book "The Lonely Crowd" by David Riesman from the 50s, where he emphasized that people. He saw a movement even then, from a world where people had a relatively small social universe with relatively deep connection, to a world where they knew more people, and this is even in the 50s, you know, like a big suburban high school versus a small town school, I think is kind of what he was talking about. But people were moving to a world where they had more social connections, but they were more superficial, and that involved different values, like moving from a time when character was valued to a time when personality was valued, in his view. And it occurred to me that you were saying some things that suggested that really that process continues to go on. More and more connections, more and more superficial.
Yes, for sure. It's very peculiar if you think about the way social media is set up. You know, I'm having a conversation with you right now. You know, let's say we were just hanging out on the beach in Santa Monica and no one else around, just me and you, and we're just having a one-on-one connection with each other where we don't have to worry about or think about whether or not what I say to you in this moment and what you say in return is going to get likes by anyone else in this world. You know, we're just being one-on-one connected.
Yeah.
It's a very peculiar situation where now people are having, I would call it pseudo connections with each other, where in reality what's happening is every thought, everything they do to respond to someone else in this one-on-one moment is actually being driven by the extent to which it's going to be liked and give them esteem, you know, for saying something.
Yeah. So more of our socializing is performative in a sense.
Yeah, that's a great way of saying it for sure. And And, people have used all sorts of words for this, and, the word virtue signaling gets thrown around, I think, too much. But you do see a lot of it, but it's thrown around a lot,
Yeah.
Because in a way, we're all put in this position of a performative, whether we want to or not, which is why I don't understand sometimes why, like, people, you're not in prison. I want to tell to people sometimes, like, you're not in prison. Like, sometimes people will try to start an argument with me on Twitter or demand that I answer their question. And I'm like, no, I don't have to do that. That'd be like me walking down the street, having a conversation with a friend, and then someone comes up and says, hey, I've been eavesdropping your conversation and I demand that I'm part of this conversation. It's like, no, we would say that's rude in real life. Right?
Yeah, and I don't think it's necessarily rude in these cases, but I do think people sometimes people are rude. I mean, I actually got a little ratioed today on Twitter, but but I do think we should all remember we have the option to just not reply. This really started with email. Email itself made it so easy to reach out to people that I had to finally figure out that I don't have to reply to every email. You just can't. It's not practical to think that there's an obligation to reply, right? Whereas back when the threshold was higher, like somebody had to sit down and write a letter, like, John McPhee, the famous New Yorker writer, was a teacher of mine in college. He has replied. I don't want to encourage people to write him, but he has replied to every letter he's ever gotten from a reader. And he's gotten a lot because all they have to do is send it to him care of the New Yorker. And he has he's had a very robust following over the years. You couldn't possibly, anyway, I guess I've made the point. I digress. So there's security. I think we should, that's the hull of the sailboat. Although it includes some, non-trivial, kinds of things to take care of, like, self-esteem, connectivity, anything, or social connection. Anything else you want to say about that before we move on to growth, to the sail?
No, I get it.
And ultimately, at the top of the sail, folks, we promise transcendence.
Oh, that's the spoiler alert.
Well, we want to keep them on board, so to speak.
Yeah. No, we can go all out with this metaphor. Yeah, but no, that's right. I would love to get into growth, because we mustn't forget that growth does exist too. We don't. Some people I do fear spend their entire lives securing the boat, their entire lives, and then they're on their deathbed.
Well, it's
with
a
deep
challenge.
Regrets.
It's a challenge. Life's tough.
For sure, and some people are put in situations they never asked for environmentally, to be bored into a very poor neighborhood where there's a lot of violence. I mean, these things, I try to make it very clear, these things depress self-actualization, and I don't think things like that are fully addressed in the field of positive psychology. That's actually been a criticism. That's been one criticism I've had.
Well, there's been a criticism that it's kind of ideologically loaded, that it's kind of, dealing with first world problems, so to speak.
Yeah, and it's not viewing, like I said, the totality of a person, right? I mean, a part of you that is a meaningful part of you is if you're put in this state of psychological entropy, as I call it in the book, and as psychologists are calling it, applying physics principles of entropy to the psychological, to the brain, and showing that, the human brain is a prediction machine, and just like physical systems can reach this state of entropy, so can the human mind of great disorder. That it prevents anything else. But you wanted to actually go higher. You wanted to talk about the growth stuff. So
I just want to pause and say the reason I brought up social media is to drive home that just the hull of the boat, keeping the hull intact, can be a real challenge, because we're living in a time when the very landscape of socializing is changing, and some people find it disorienting, and people in high school and college get depressed if they don't get enough affirmation on Instagram or whatever. And so it's challenging, but yeah, let's move on to, you can't take the hull of the boat for granted, but let's move on to the sail, the growth, which itself has, 3 dimensions. And maybe here we can get into exactly what you're doing, what you're trying to bring to the kind of structure you're trying to bring to a Maslowian worldview, the way you flesh out the dimensions, with subdimensions, and then, use kind of psychological survey data to kind of give a certain rigor to these things. Anyway, so growth has the three main dimensions, right? Are exploration, love, and purpose. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
So talk about those. That's a lot. And just to give people a sense, and then exploration has like all of these subdomains. Yeah. Like it has openness, which is a well-known psychological trait, much studied, adventure, curiosity, and then openness, just to take one example, has its own domains of like flow, imagination, and I just want to give people a sense that, I mean, it's a very accessible book, but it also it has some heft.
It's a very nerdy self-help book.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
But, we're still, at the end of the day, marketing it as self-help. I mean, we have a whole appendix. We actually have two appendices, but one appendix specifically with exercises so people can apply the stuff in their daily life. And I hope this book appeals to I'll put it this way again, like the thinking person's guide to growth and living a meaningful life, Like you want to intentionally understand the theory behind what you're doing. You don't want to just be told to do what you're doing, right? I hope there's a lot of people that don't want to just be told, like, here are the it would have been easy for me to just publish the exercises. That's what so many self-help books do, right? But there is a theory and science behind a lot of this. So the exploration, just as I say, the need for safety is, provides the foundation for the boat. The need for exploration really is the foundation for growth. You can, in a sense, view it as two different triangles, right? Two different hierarchies. You have the growth hierarchy and the security hierarchy. And when you launch from that place of exploration, you can build higher levels of integration, and you can, put a dash of being love there, which is love which is kind of a more universal kind of love. Love is an attitude, loving people you don't even like, people that are not in your in-group. See, the thing I talk about in connection, this was another thing I wanted to do, is I wanted to separate the need for connection from the need for love, or universal love, because I didn't think the field of psychology really did a great job of distinguishing between those two things. But all this research is emerging on the need for connection, showing just how tied it is to oxytocin, which the oxytocin, it turns out, is really the in-group love hormone or neuromodulator. And that's interesting, and to think sometimes we need to untether ourselves from the oxytocin in order to have some more spiritual forms of love for people that are even great on our nerves. So I'll stop there and let you talk.
Okay, so in terms of what should people do with, say, a category like exploration? I mean, the idea, I take it, is that these are things you can cultivate. Now, I mean, there are people who are just naturally explorers. I mean, you talk about this guy, Alex Honnold. I don't know how you pronounce the last name.
Honnold, yeah.
There was this famous documentary that I saw, pretty famous, called Free Solo. Have you seen the documentary?
Oh, I saw everything about him.
Oh, man. So this is the guy who, without any ropes or anything, climbed El Capitan, which is basically just a sheer, huge cliff. You treated him, I don't want to quite say as a role model, but you saw a lot of laudatory things in him, whereas I watched that thing and my basic reaction is, that guy's crazy. I mean, and they did the fMRI where his amygdala wasn't as responsive to a lot of like fear images as people, and there's clearly something, if the average human is the norm, which by definition it is, there's something off about this guy, right? I mean, this is not normal.
Well, how do we know you're not off?
Well,
how do we know you're not the one that's off?
In certain respects, I am, but I think not.
Maybe he has the right idea.
I'm not saying it's bad. I am saying it's bad. I mean,
this is
well
like
be dead within 5 years, but that's his choice.
Yeah.
I guess you could say, right? I mean,
well, it is
if
possible.
If people haven't seen this documentary, Free Solo, they really should.
Yeah, for sure. I think there's something special about him. I don't know if it's off. So, I mean, I think that, like, you see this with people on the autism spectrum as well. People
he
tend to view that
he is thought to be on the spectrum, isn't he?
He could quite possibly be. I don't think he was officially diagnosed, but there is a sense of, there's a certain intensity to him, a certain narrow focus, and just a really narrow focus and on mastering this one particular thing, almost to the exclusion of everything else in his life, you know. But I think that what the lesson he can teach us, any of us, is that he didn't start off with no fear. It may appear at this moment in his life as though, wow, this is a guy with missing the chip in his brain for fear. He said that when he started off, at the very foundational level of this, he was scared in the beginning, but he trained himself to manage that uncertainty and anxiety so much that he didn't fear the actual moment when it arrived. What he did, I mean, he prepares years in advance, and he choreographs things to such a meticulous degree.
Oh, yeah.
That what he's doing is reducing the uncertainty so much in his preparation that it's no big deal. People call him No Big Deal Hanold. You know, that's his nickname. Isn't that an important lesson?
He had climbed it with ropes, so he kind of scoped the whole thing out time, and he knew exactly what path where he needed to veer left by 20 feet but it's an amazing thing. Anyway, I mean, I would love to have less fear. So I'd love to use him as a role model in that way. And I would like to be more adventurous, not exactly in that way. Not in the sense that I literally
I'm sure
die
there are other ways.
if things don't work out.
yeah.
Just that I get ratioed if things don't work out. I'd like to be a little more open to being ratioed, I guess. So exploration, as I said, that has a lot of dimensions. Now, when the subtitle is The New Science of Self-Actualization. So you're trying to bring a little bit in the way of scientific validation or structure to a Maslowian worldview. Is that right? Do you want to talk a little about the nuts and bolts of that? Like, what is the scientific part that you're bringing to this?
Well, I've certainly been trying to use the scientific method to understand what are these characteristics that make us most likely to feel like integrated whole people, that brings out the best in us. And I've been studying things like the light triad, which that was the focus of our other chat, and we're trying to use the tools of science to see what a light triad would look like of personality. You know, I do what I can do, and that's science, and I try to apply that method using a lot of different perspectives. So I like to draw on evolutionary psychology, social psychology, clinical psychology, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Lots of different kinds of psychologies that we can draw on to come up with an integrated framework. But it felt like it was time for an update on Maslow because it's been 75 years, and there just hasn't been too many attempts to resurrect those concepts. We like I said, we have different concepts today, and the word self-actualization, I think, has a lot of woo-woo connotations. So I'm trying to legitimize maybe some things that scientifically legitimize. Well,
you make a lot of use of. Your background has put you very much in touch with, constructing and using scales, right? Like personality inventories, and you kind of got your start in the field studying intelligence, right? And looking at what tests do tell us about people, and you constructed your own kind of self-actualization inventory, the scale that I took and that we talked about last time, right? And
that's right. Personality psychology forms a bedrock of this, and I think that's in the spirit of Maslow. Maslow is very interested in personality and motivation and the connection between the two. We're driven a lot by our proclivities. It may be more than we want to admit, especially with some sociology theories might want to completely ignore that fact. But, we really are. They're called experience. Genes produce experience-producing drives, is the way Bouchard and others have described it. I think that's a good way of thinking about the role of our biology and how it interacts with our culture.
Okay. So again, in growth, before we get to transcendence, you've got exploration, love, purpose, and all these are things you can cultivate.
I do think so. I think that we can, each of us, to a degree probably larger than we realize, can construct ourselves. We're constantly in that process of creating ourselves and reaching toward who we want to be by our moment-to-moment, day-to-day decisions. And like Maslow really did believe that human development was a two-step forward, one-step back. Two-step forward, one-step back dynamic, constant dynamic. He didn't view life as a video game, where you have these lockstep progressions. We can address multiple needs simultaneously, but we're constantly falling backwards and then trying to grow. But as long as our entire lives we strive for growth, that's the important thing. The important thing is not that you're perfect. Not that you reach enlightenment. There's how many of these so-called enlightened gurus are really themselves, it's built on a faulty foundation, and
how many of them are not involved in sex scandals at this moment?
This is what I'm saying. They'll maybe abuse their positions of power, etc. And that's clearly being deprivation driven, not growth driven. So I do think we can work on this, and it's just a matter of setting the intention to do so. And
you think you kind of need to work on it if you want to get to the transcendence part.
Yes, and I think that whether or not people realize that they would love more of that in their lives. Maslow called them peak experiences. What are the most wondrous moments that make life worth living? What are those moments?
And this is an underappreciated part of Maslow. I mean, again, the version of the pyramid that I just held up from my old textbook, I just got up to the top of the growth part, and there was a flat thing, and it didn't say anything about transcendence up there. But this is something that Maslow, more than is appreciated, paid attention to.
Oh yeah, and people don't really talk about that aspect of his theory because that was very late in his life, just the past couple of years of his life. He was talking about the transcendent experiences and transcendent values, but he did talk about different kinds of self-actualizers towards the end of his life, and he started to make the distinction between transcending self-actualizers and non-transcending self-actualizers. He called transcending self-actualizers, he called them the transcenders. But anyway, no. But no, he called them the transcenders, and he argued that the transcenders in this world are those that are constantly motivated by transcendence. So each of these things can be viewed as motivations. Each of these needs are associated with their own worldview and motivation. Well, what is the transcendence? So self-actualization worldview and motivation is, I have to maximize my full potential, my own individual potential. And so many people, that's their highest thing in life. But what would it mean if your motivation was at the transcendence level? And Maslow argued that at the highest level of consciousness, we're motivated by things that are beyond health. We actually can be beyond health. We can reach a level of integration where it suddenly makes sense to say things such as, the more unhappy you are, the higher your mental health. Like people are, what does that mean? Well, there is a level at which a lot of the false dichotomies we have in our society break down. And I'll put it this way, and I'll ask this question because I really do want people to read the book, and I don't want to give it all away. I want to kind of tease a little bit what I mean about transcenders, but there seems to be something different between by the way, I want people to read the book not just because the money, I'm saying also like it took me a lot to get to the point of explaining all this, and it's hard for me to just say it right now without laying all the groundwork, right. But there is something different from having being unhappy and depressed because you're not loved, you're not fed, you're not respected, and the kind of deprivation and being unhappy and depressed because there's not enough beauty in the world, there's not enough justice in the world, there's not enough meaningfulness in the world. You see a greater vision for what humans could be that people around you aren't actualizing. There's a difference there, and this is what Maslow was trying to get at. He called it meta motivation. We can be motivated by our deficiencies, but when you're meta motivated, there's a level of motivation where it makes sense that the more frustrated you are is actually an indication that you're having these transcendent values that you're trying to realize, and that's a good thing. And it's a good thing to be frustrated by a lack of injustice, a lack of justice, I should say, a lack of not enough beauty around you, not enough meaningfulness, etc. He had a whole list of what he called the B values, the values of being itself.
Okay. Yeah, I was just reflecting on to what extent my unhappiness is that elevated kind, and to what extent it's more like I'm not getting enough respect.
Well, what about from truth? Well, okay, what about from one of his B values is truth seeking.
Yeah.
Now, I view you as pretty high in that.
I scored high on that part of your self-actualization inventory last time. Of course, it's based on self-evaluation, so there's a little, I guess, maybe possible circularity in my calling myself a truth seeker, because if I'm not being truthful, then, well, anyway, never mind.
But let's say, I want to really stick with this because I see this in you. I see you as a transcender, is what I'm saying, and I want you to see it in yourself. So let's say that you're watching the news and our president or someone else says something that's so blatantly untrue.
Yeah.
It's blatant. And that gives you a great sense of anger and maybe even a temporary depression. Now, that's not the sort of thing that you need medication for. It's not the sort of thing you go to you say, I'm feeling depressed, and you go and you say, please give me serotonin, reuptake. No, I mean, this is stemming from a meta motivation to increase the B value of truth in the world.
Yeah.
Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I was just thinking, like, you emphasize purpose in the growth part. That's one of the three kind of dimensions. And that's another thing. I don't want to get too self-indulgent here, but the good news is I'm much less self-indulgent than I was last time, which was like 50% about me, because I had just taken your self-transcendence test. But, and sense of purpose was another thing I scored high. On balance, by the way, I did not score high on self-actualization particularly, but on purpose, I did have a strong sense of purpose. But the thing about that is that allows you having a strong sense of purpose and identifying with an idealistic purpose, like making the world better, kind of allows you to conflate the unhappiness of the high-minded kind with the unhappiness of the less high-minded kind. In other words, like, I'm not getting any respect. So I can tell myself that I'm unhappy because I'm trying to make these arguments that will save the world and nobody's paying attention. But actually, that's just another way of saying I'm unhappy because I'm not getting as much respect as I'd like. Do you see what I mean?
Yes, but then you wouldn't be motivated by the B value. One of the definitions.
So the B value is the high-minded one, right?
Yes, correct. But one of the characteristic of a B value is that there is no further end. It is the end. It is the end value. These are the ultimate verities. But what that means is you're motivated by it because you simply want to see more of that in the world, not for any other reason. So if you were doing it and there was a reason because you really wanted more self-esteem or accolades, and what was really depressing you is that every time you say something along these lines on Twitter, you're not getting enough likes for it, then that would be an indication that you're still deprivation motivated. But I really do think there are transcenders and people who strive toward these things being an end in themselves, and quite frankly, most of them are not on Twitter. Probably, they're not. They're living their lives, trying to do what they do and try to bring about in the world. They're not that concerned with. They're concerned with the impact they're making in the world, but not necessarily the esteem aspect of it. Yeah.
I mean, I've always admired, like, when I was a freshman, Ralph Nader came and gave a talk. And at the end of the talk, he like some students came up the stage and he was just handing these leaflets out to them. And he just struck me as a person. I mean, I'm sure like everyone, he had his pettiness and his ego and everything, but he seemed to me like someone just so absorbed in his cause. It really seemed kind of laudable. And I've always admired people who can really, I mean, it takes a kind of selflessness to really be fully absorbed in and I don't think I have that. I'd like to get there. Maybe talking to you is the first step toward getting there. So I know you don't want to give away too much, but there is a fascinating, very long list of characteristics of transcenders, and we can't give away much because it would take too long to read them. It's surprisingly long. Now, this is like one of the gray boxes, right? Now, is this all straight Maslow? Or
yes, that's
so. Maslow himself had this long list, that they perceive the sacred within the secular, and so on. Now, they are more responsive to beauty. There's a lot of things, and I got to think there's very few people to whom all of these apply very robustly.
Agreed. And yes, maybe it's
nice to have as much of it as you can, I guess.
Well, why can't we view all these things as aspirational? Why can't we? What's wrong with having more North Star guides in our lives?
Right.
And I think there's such a lack of that. There's such a lack of leadership, in a sense, in our world today of guides for that. Now, a lot of people go to religion for that, of course, but as I've argued in the book, I'm much more for secularizing. I can't be trouble saying that word, or I should say democratizing spirituality. Having us.
But also kind of secular. I mean, I guess that's part of my question is Maslow himself and what you do with Maslow part of a way of having a secular version of the spiritual, or you know what I mean?
I think so. Oh yeah, I do know what you mean, and I think so because what he really wanted to show humans is that we don't have to appeal to the gods above to be great or to be good. That these potentialities exist in our DNA. And I think he would have been very happy if he lived today to see the strides being made in fields like evolutionary psychology and other aspects of the biology of how we're wired for compassion. Of course we're wired for lots of naughty things. Of course. You can't deny that. But we are also wired for lots of things, gratitude and things that can bring us outside of ourselves. I think he really, before there was even a science of it, he was trying to make the argument, look, these are part of human nature as well. And we don't need to appeal to the gods above in order to realize those potentialities. That's really, I think, what he has tried to spend his whole life realizing that vision. Okay. And would his peak experiences, the transcendence part, that would include a lot of, you talk about William James a little in the book, and he had his kind of varieties of religious experience and kind of defining the mystical experience. I mean, all of these things could qualify. In a way, maybe I'm asking, could actual religious experiences or Eastern mystical experiences qualify as transcendence? All these things that we put under different labels and different headings in terms of their belief, I would argue, are all operating on the same biological machinery. There is a fundamental human experience that we can all rally around. We don't have to just rally around our own in-group belief. Mm-hmm. And there is also a twist ending to this book. I don't know how far you got in the book, but there's something beyond peak experiences, and that's. Do you feel like giving it away, or do you want to make people pay retail for that? Well, I had thought earlier when I made that point about, I want people to read the book. I actually immediately felt kind of guilty. I want to be honest for saying that, because I actually don't want to be that guy. I don't want to be the guy who's like, well, buy my book. Because I don't like that. Well, but if you believe, it's like you said, you put a lot of work in it. You think that there's virtue in people's reading it. I do. And I wanted to help them. But anyway, say as much or as little about as you want about that. It's more my hesitation is actually just more that I want to do the topic justice in like a 2-3 like there was also like an introverted part of me that like, and by the way, I think I say the word like too often, so I'm going to try to work on that, but there's an introverted part of me that spent like 5 years writing this book and trying to craft every sentence, and there's a part of me that wants to just do that and then not ever have to talk about it, because I put all the hard thought and work, and then I don't want to start undoing my own self because I'm put on this, being forced to be on this. Does that make sense? Like, can you resonate with that at all? Like when you work so hard?
Yeah, oh, very much. Plus, I mean, it's when you write a book and then you promote it, I mean, some people enjoy promoting things. I don't particularly, and there is, there's just the feeling that when you talk to the publicity people and they're trying to bring out certain things, there's this feeling that you're cheapening the product. Well, even calling it a product cheapens it, I guess, but further cheapening the product. There's that. I mean, that said, it can be very fun to talk about a book, so I don't know. Your mileage may vary.
I'll go there. I'll say this. I'll say the twist, or at least I'll touch on it. Maslow very much believed that peak experiences was the height of transcendence until he himself faced his mortality head on. And I think I bring this up because I think it relates a lot to the world that we're living in and our own experience of facing perhaps our mortality to an extent we never have before, especially if we're older. We have preconditions, for this virus, things like, wow, you mean I could just tomorrow get this and then within the next 2 days I'm out? I mean, that's a scary thought.
Yeah.
But Maslow realized once he faced his own mortality that he had a heightened sense of transcendence like he had never imagined. He didn't even, he had talked about theoretically, but here he was actually experiencing it. And it perplexed him because according to his
he had heart trouble, right? And
correct.
And so he naturally had a sense of, and he died pretty young, 62.
That's right.
And so this is the part of his life you're talking about when he's actually having pain on a regular basis. He's been diagnosed as having heart trouble. He even had a heart attack, I think, didn't he?
Very end of his life, yeah. And so the past year and a half of his life, he kind of reconfigured his whole theory of transcendence from peak experiences to what he called plateau experiences. And that's the part that people haven't read about, or also his theory Z is part of that as well. But the plateau experience is a term he adopted from his Indian colleague, Asrani, U.A. Asrani, who was a mystic and spiritual leader in India. But this idea of the plateau experience, Maslow called it like you're not, he said, it's like lounging in heaven, not getting so excited about it. Mm-hmm. So the plateau is the peak experience is all about the moment, the excitement, the euphoria of the moment, and then you face reality later that day. But how can we cultivate more in our life this plateau experience where we kind of walk around in this mild state of wonder and mindfulness? And look, I don't think that state is altogether that different from what you write about in your book on the benefits of a silent meditation retreat, or like what you experienced personally, as you so beautifully describe in your book, your own personal experiences of like a bird chirping or something. And you have some of these stories, you're like, wow, I've never really thought about at that level. And that's what Maslow had more of once he had that mortality salience. And I wonder if any good can come out of this, this virus, that the experience we're all having. A, I wonder how it can unite us more as a species, but B, I also wonder how it can lock us more into the present moment and experience this form of transcendence Maslow was talking about than we ever had before in our lives. If there's any silver lining at all to this.
That's interesting. So, while you were talking about Maslow kind of, I guess, reaching this plateau as mortality descended on him, I was reminded of this phrase, the death of ambition. Robert Penn Warren, the poet, when he got old, he wrote about what it's like I think he was maybe in his 90s by then, to have more or less lost your ambition and the virtues of that. Is that related? Because also, I mean, on a, the state you can get in on a silent meditation retreat is this definitely a state where you're not driven by the normal ambitions. Mm-hmm. Is that part of what happened to Maslow? Absolutely.
He has a quote very, very close to the end of his life, his last public seminar. He really said that, if we can only he said that the competition and my ambition suddenly became foolish to me. Like all those things that matter to me,
yep.
Just I saw in this clear moment just how silly it all was. And I could see much more clearly what really mattered. And he talks about the shift in priority, but there's a lot of research showing this shift in priority happens in lots of different ways. I tried to triangulate things. So I have a whole section on people who do LSD. They tend to have this shift. People who, I talk about mindfulness, extended mindfulness individuals, but those who also just have faced their mortality in some way, maybe a cancer diagnosis or lots of other things, they all tend to describe these similar experiences. And I think using the tools of science to better capture those experiences. And there are scientists, I mean, I'm one of them, but like my colleague David Yaden is doing great research along these lines as well. And there are others, Jonathan Haidt, Dr. Keltner, Barbara Fredrickson. I list a number of these scientists who are in the front lines of these kinds of experiences and what we call transcendent experiences.
Yeah. What was I started thinking about those individual people. Yeah, David Yaden has done a lot of good work here, and Dr. Keltner's out west where you are now in California. I know what I was going to ask. You mentioned LSD. What do you make of the, earlier I alluded to drugs as a possible kind of shortcut to peak experiences that maybe might or might not give you a valid experience. What do you think of the growing use of psychedelics in a kind of intentionally spiritual way? At least that's people, they're doing it in groups, and there are leaders and teachers and shamans and so on.
Yeah, I'm going to say something. I don't know if it's controversial, but I think it's incredibly underrated, the potential use of those things to be aids to living a more integrated life. But it shouldn't be a substitute. Mm-hmm. And I really like the kind of work, the thoughtful work, such people like Catherine McLean, who I feature in the book. She has devoted her whole life now to helping people integrate these experiences into the rest of their lives. Not so you just have these peak experiences through the use of it, but how can you use those insights you gleaned from using those in a way to live your life in more of this state of wonder and awe in your daily life, and gratitude and appreciation and meaning, all these things that tend to come along for the ride. But I think it's starting to be quite undeniable, the positive benefits of psilocybin, for instance, or some of these other things that can really reduce depression. And in a lot of ways, what they're doing at the most existential level is they're reducing your fear of death. And that kind of is how this whole book ends, is I talk about the ultimate unknown, that death is the ultimate unknown. We have lots of unknowns in our lives, but if we can reduce our psychological entropy for the ultimate unknown, that's a really nerdy way of framing it, but I think that's the correct technical way of framing the issue. We can live a transcendent life like we've never imagined would be even possible. And that's what Maslow believed, and I believe the science is bearing that out. I think Maslow would be very excited to see the science on it.
Okay, well, that is a good note to end on, I guess. Do you want to anything else you want to say about the book or your other work?
No, this was a really great opportunity for me to flesh out some ideas and to chat with you, and you really gave me a good chance to get a lot of the goodies out. I do want to say something, kind of a meta thing. You know, I've never viewed myself as a kind of like guru type figure or whatever. I hear myself talk sometimes in these kind of interviews, and I'm, you know, like I'm preaching or something. And I just want to say that, you know, I think that we're all in this together, and the way I view transcendence is not like being above anyone else in humanity. It's not like you're looking down at other humans. In essence, transcendence is the way I see it, is feeling a great oneness with the rest of humanity, not being like standing above it. So I just wanted to end on that note and just how I personally view transcendence. I think anyone who comes up to you and they're like, I have transcended, as though it's a state they reached instead of a ongoing process, you probably want to view with suspicion.
Yeah. Okay. That's good. I was looking for more people to view with suspicion.
You're funny. You're funny.
I don't have enough of those. All right. Well, thank you so much, Scott. The book is called Transcend, the New Science of Self-Actualization. And people should also listen to your podcast, the Psychology Podcast.
Thank you.
Which, I don't know, comes out on Thursdays or something?
Yeah, it tends to come out on Thursdays. That's exactly right. Thank you. Yeah, the Psychology Podcast has been doing that for 6 years, and it's still going strong. It's such a great chance for me to talk to people. It's a bit surreal that now the tables are turned a little bit, and now I'm going to be appearing on other people's podcasts. You know, it's like, oh wow, I'm going to talk about myself now. It's like, you know, I'm so used to, you know, tell me all about yourself, and then I just listen. And now I'm like, well,
last time we had the conversation on my podcast, you naturally assumed your role as podcast host, and I wound up being almost embarrassed by how much we talked.
No, don't be embarrassed. I'm endlessly fascinated with my fellow humans. I feel like it's such a fun thing for me to be able to understand someone else. But thanks for the opportunity for me to talk about my own sort of B values, so to speak.
My pleasure. Everyone should go and get the book. I think you said just enough about the plateau to you know, I mean,
Good.
Not that you did it for marketing purposes, but I think your publicity people would be happy. You just gave them a taste of that plateau.
Good.
For the rest, they'll have to buy the book. Okay. Thanks a lot, Scott.
Thank you.